Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going way back to early 2025, and we're going to look at U.S.-Mexico relations. And it was a pretty tense time back then. You wanted to know more about all the back and forth around tariffs. And you sent in this AP News article from February 3rd of that year. So let's dive in.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're looking at this specific date because it really captures a moment of uncertainty. The article talks about how President Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on all Mexican imports, and then President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, she's trying to avoid them.
Yeah, the article even says that Sheinbaum is anxiously waiting to see if Trump will actually follow through and hoping for a direct phone call. Sounds pretty high stakes. I mean, this wasn't the first time that Trump had used tariffs as a bargaining chip with Mexico.
No, not at all. In fact, just a few months before this, Trump had threatened similar tariffs and only suspended them when Mexico agreed to deploy 10,000 National Guard troops to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Wow, 10,000 troops. That's a huge commitment. What was Trump hoping to achieve with that kind of move?
Well, his stated goal was to crack down on drug trafficking and illegal immigration. It was a controversial tactic. A lot of people said it was a really heavy-handed approach to a complex issue.
Yeah, for sure. So knowing that history was Mexico basically just caving to the pressure again with these new tariff threats in February.
Well, Mexico was definitely making a strong case against the tariffs. They pointed to declining numbers of migrants at the U.S. border. They also talked about how they had extradited 29 high-level cartel figures to the U.S., and they had dismantled over 100 drug labs. And one of those people who they extradited was even involved in the killing of a DEA agent way back in 1985. So they were really trying to show that they were serious about tackling these issues.
It sounds like they were trying to say, hey, we're already doing the work. New tariffs would be unnecessary. There's this other detail in the article that kind of jumped out at me. It mentions that U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that Mexico offered to match the tariffs the U.S. was planning to impose on China. What do you make of that?
That's really fascinating. It's possible that it was a strategic move by Mexico, a way to kind of signal that they were willing to cooperate economically with the U.S., even if they didn't agree with the tariffs themselves.
Almost like they were trying to find common ground, but on their own terms.
Yeah.
It feels like this whole situation is like a high-stakes game of poker with huge implications for both countries economically and politically.
Exactly. And it's important to understand that this was all happening within a broader context of Trump's trade policy, which was often characterized as protectionist. Basically, he was trying to protect American industries from foreign competition by using things like tariffs.
Okay, so what about the impact of these tariffs? 25% is a significant increase. The article doesn't go into much detail, but I'm curious, what kind of everyday goods would have been affected, and how would that have impacted people on both sides of the border?
Well, it would have been a pretty wide range of goods, everything from agricultural products like avocados and tomatoes to manufactured goods like cars and electronics. And the impact, we'd probably see higher prices for consumers in both the U.S. and Mexico, which could hurt businesses and definitely strain household budgets.
So we've got this tense standoff, we have high-stakes negotiations, and we've got the potential for some serious economic fallout. But the article leaves us hanging. We don't actually know how this played out. Did Trump end up imposing the tariffs? What happened next in this economic tug of war?
That's the big question, isn't it? And maybe even more importantly, what was the long-term impact on the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico? Did this escalate tensions, or did they find some kind of common ground? It really does make you think, and looking closely at how Mexico responded to these tariff threats, we can learn a lot about their strategy for dealing with the Trump administration back then.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of strategy are we talking about here?
Well, it seems like they were walking a very fine line. On the one hand, they took concrete actions to address some of Trump's concerns about immigration and drug trafficking, like deploying the National Guard, extraditing those cartel leaders, dismantling drug labs. I mean, those were major concessions.
Yeah, they were definitely sending a message that they were serious about tackling those issues.
Exactly. But at the same time, they were also pushing back against the idea that Mexico was solely responsible for these problems. They were pointing to the decreasing migrant numbers that we talked about, and they were really emphasizing criticizing their own efforts to combat the cartels. It was like they were arguing that these were shared responsibilities, not just something that Mexico had to solve on its own.
So like a combination of appeasement and assertion?
Yeah.
It sounds like they were trying to avoid being backed into a corner where they had to just completely give in to Trump's demands.
Precisely. And that offer to match tariffs on China, that could have been a really savvy way to shift the focus away from these security issues and put it on economic cooperation. Almost like they were saying, we're willing to work with you on trade, but we're not going to be bullied.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. This is such a fascinating example of just how complex international relations can be. You've got these economic pressures that are being used as leverage, but at the same time, there's this very delicate dance of diplomacy that's happening behind the scenes.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that all of this was taking place against a backdrop of like shifting global power dynamics. The U.S. under Trump was embracing a more protectionist stance on trade, while Mexico was trying to maintain these good economic relationships with both the U.S. and China. Not an easy position to be in.
Right. It's like this giant chessboard where every move has ripple effects that are felt all over the world. It's all so strategic. But I can't help but think about the human side of things, too. You know, the article mentions that Sheinbaum was anxiously waiting for a phone call from Trump. It makes me wonder what was going through her mind, like what kind of pressure she must have been feeling.
Oh, of course. And it wasn't just Sheinbaum either. Think about all the people who were living in those border towns, the businesses that relied on cross-border trade, the families with loved ones on both sides of that border. I mean, those tariff threats had the potential to just disrupt countless lives.
Yeah, it's a really powerful reminder that these big geopolitical maneuvers have very real consequences for everyday people. We don't actually know the answer to this from the article, but I'm curious. Do you think that Trump actually went ahead and imposed those tariffs?
It's hard to say for sure, but based on his past actions and his statements in this article, it seems likely that he at least followed through with some level of tariffs. The real question is how Mexico responded. Did they retaliate with tariffs of their own? Did they try to find other ways to mitigate the damage?
And what about the long-term impact on the relationship between the two countries? Did this whole episode escalate tensions, or did it somehow lead to like a stronger partnership down the line?
Those are all great questions, and unfortunately our deep dive only gives us a glimpse into this one particular moment in time. We're left with more questions than answers, which I think says a lot about just how dynamic and unpredictable international relations can be.
It's like we've uncovered one piece of a much larger puzzle. But even that single piece offers some really fascinating insights into diplomacy economics and the very real human impact of these high-stakes decisions.
Exactly, and I think it just underscores the importance of staying informed and critically analyzing events like this as they unfold, understanding the context and all the nuances. It's easy to get swept up in the headlines, but taking a deeper dive like we're doing now, it allows us to see the bigger picture and really grapple with the complexities.
Well said. This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. We've gained such a deeper understanding of this really pivotal moment in U.S.-Mexico relations, and it's just sparked some really great questions about power and leverage and the search for solutions in our really complex world.
Yeah, it really has been a fascinating look at the specific moment in history with these much wider implications. We've talked about this idea of leverage quite a bit. Thinking back to the tariff threats, how much power did the U.S. actually have over Mexico in this situation? Well, considering that the U.S. is Mexico's biggest trading partner, the threat of tariffs definitely carried a lot of weight. But we have to remember that Mexico wasn't powerless. They could have retaliated with their own tariffs. They could have strengthened their economic ties with other countries. Maybe they could have appealed to international organizations for support.
Right, so it wasn't a one-way street. It was more like a complex web of interdependence with both countries having at least some degree of leverage.
Exactly. And I think that's a key takeaway for anyone trying to understand these kinds of situations. We often hear about international disputes in terms of winners and losers, but the reality is much more nuanced than that.
Like that giant chessboard we were talking about, right? Every move has these consequences, and those ripple effects can be really hard to predict.
Exactly. And this whole episode really highlights the limits of using economic tools like tariffs to try to achieve political goals. While they can definitely apply pressure, they can also backfire pretty badly and end up hurting both sides.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there are more effective ways to address these complex issues, like immigration and drug trafficking, maybe solutions that involve more cooperation and less confrontation.
Right, that's a great point. This whole situation underscores the importance of open dialogue and diplomacy and a genuine willingness to find some common ground. Because these unilateral actions, especially the ones with huge economic consequences, often just escalate tensions and they make it so much harder to find solutions.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that these issues are incredibly complex. There aren't any easy answers, but maybe by understanding the nuances and the interconnectedness of it all, we can start to move towards more constructive approaches.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to leave our listeners with today. This whole deep dive into this specific moment in U.S.-Mexico relations has given us a lot to consider when it comes to global power dynamics and economic leverage and the search for solutions in this world that's, more interconnected than ever.
It has definitely left me with a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey, and to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues. Stay curious, and never stop seeking a deeper understanding of our world. Until next time.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.